realistically, whenever you're looking at World War II, this is the same in Europe as it is in the Pacific. You have to realize that it's almost a continuation of World War One. That's very obvious over in Europe with Hitler and the Third Reich and their rise to dominance and their motivations for doing so. But even over in the Pacific, Japan's side of the story as well is a continuation left over from World War One also.
Sure.
I mean, we could even go back before that, when we start looking at, Japan, way back in the 1800s, it's going to be a closed-off, isolationist nation that's not really going to have any outside influence whatsoever. And then all of a sudden, here we are, we show up and say, yo, you're opening your doors for business.
Yeah.
We're coming over.
Yeah.
You're gonna get tapped into the rest of the world here, and you could even start that far back. But one of the things we really want to look at least in the aftermath of World War One, and the Russo-Japanese War, which is a little bit before World War One, it is after the war ends. Japan is on the Allied side, right? They're not on the side of Germany in World War One. They're on our side. And them being victors, they would think that they get an equal share in the spoils, especially when you look at countries like France and England and how they divvied up, a lot of these various colonies around the world, essentially, and a lot of the influence that they had in different regions. It's this era, almost specifically, that you can say, the sun never rests on the British Empire, and it's almost true. They're huge, right? They have their hands in everything. Well, Japan kind of feels like they get stiffed at the end of World War One, and that boils down to a few things. So right after the war, they do gain control of numerous islands in the Pacific. But in 1922, there's going to be a naval treaty signed in Washington, D.C., and it has to do with the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations, right? It's the Allies and their League of Government. Or their League of National Governments. And in part of this treaty, it is limiting, how big fleets can be for different nations. Obviously Germany has all kind of different rules thrust upon it after World War One. They can't have a standing army. They can't have this, that, X, Y, Z. They owe reparations. Everybody knows that side of the story. But what's interesting is Japan, being part of the Allies, they're kind of given a little bit of a rough deal in this treaty, because what comes out as a result of this treaty is their navy, what they agree to in this treaty, can only be 2/3 the size of the U.S.'s navy.
That's
right?
unfair.
And they're on the winning team. Like, wait, we're on your team. Why don't we get the same privileges you guys do?
The United States terminated the 1911 commercial treaty between the United States and Japan. This led to an American embargo of airplanes, parts, machining tools, and aviation gasoline. That embargo was expanded, further with different changes in 1940 to include oil, iron, steel scrap, and of course other war commodities that would be needed by Japan. Now, Great Britain and the Netherlands, they also joined the embargo. So everybody's getting involved in something, somehow. Everybody's sucked into something. And now with this in place, the Japanese leaders, they already got this figured out. They know, we're going to face economic ruin. We only have 2 years. If it continues like this, and every time there's an embargo and an increase of something,
the pressure just keeps getting higher and higher.
And the United States says, okay, you got to get out of there. You have to leave China, and we'll open this up again. But for Japan, that was not the case, and they didn't want to do that, obviously. And so right there, just like you said, things are heating up even worse. That everything's escalating. Mm-hmm. Everybody's getting ticked off, especially the Japanese. With that, recognizing that the Chinese are playing an important role in the war with Japan, the Lend-Lease Act formalized U.S. aid to China. So now we can legally bring things and put them in there to the Chinese to help them fight against the Japanese. But the Japanese are in control of all the Chinese coastlines, like I said before. So they had established land routes through the French Indochina, which was French colony, and so that's how supplies were getting in there. Now, by January of 1940, Japan, what was left of the that treaty, the 1911 Commerce Treaty, they just deleted the whole thing. They said, we're cutting off ties with that. They're not going to rely on anybody. They're not leaving. They're not backing up. They're not backing down. They're going to basically push all the Western powers out.
Things are heating up. When we've talked about that pressure going up, and it's across the world. Now, I had mentioned earlier that historically, the U.S. standing military, peacetime military, is typically small and gets bigger as war comes.
Right.
Now, this is going to kind of put into perspective what I mean by that. In 1939, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Marine Corps, all together, their manpower totaled 334,373 personnel.
That's not a lot.
All of them.
There's 1 million Japanese soldiers
just in China.
just in China.
Right? So that's all of them. Now, some big stuff is going to be happening from that point carrying forward. Obviously, Germany is going to invade Poland in 1939.
They're on the move.
And then in September of 1940, President Roosevelt's going to do something that really had never been done before. It's the first time this ever happened in U.S. history. I think it's the first and the last time this has ever happened, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe so.
I think we'll have to check on that. If we're wrong, we apologize.
Yeah.
But I think it's the first and the last time this ever actually has happened in U.S. history. But Roosevelt is going to sign into into political action. He's gonna make it a necessity for all males between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for the first ever peacetime draft. He's going to sign the Selective Training and Service Act.
All right.
Now, that being said, we mentioned the numbers in 39. This is how good the U.S. is at mobilizing, and it really is mind-blowing. In that 1 year, in 39, it goes from 334,000 and some change up to 458,000. Then by 1941, so the year that we are actually going to get into the war, and keep in mind, we don't get into the war until the end of that year.
Yeah.
I mean, you could really say 1942 if you're
Yeah.
it's splitting hairs at that
By the
point.
close of business.
But that number goes all the way up to 1.8 million.
All right.
So we went in a matter of just over a year. We went from 335,000 to 1.8 million.
We're in the game.
Yep, we
Get
sure
in.
are.
Come
We
on
sure
in,
are.
guys.
There's going to be some other stuff that happens. The French are going to be defeated. Obviously, in France, Germany, and their blitzkrieg just zoom right across
Crushed
all
them.
of France. It ends up with this. The British military is having to do their evacuation from Dunkirk. Things are not looking good, right?
For anybody.
You have that going on over in Europe, and then over in the Pacific theater, things are not looking any better. The whole you were talking about the French Indochina routes and stuff.
Right.
The Japanese are going to gain control of those as well.
Wow.
So there's no more U.S. materials that are going to be able to make it into China to support the Chinese. We'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And the Japanese are continuing to expand regularly. They're just taking up more and more terrain, more and more area, more and more ports, more and more roads, more sea lanes, you name it. They are taking control of it all.
The United States says, you got to stop doing that.
Well, yeah, eventually you do have to put your foot down.
You got to stop doing that, please.
So this is what's going to really be, I would say, the catalyst that makes the Japanese decide, all right, the time is now. We can't do this pseudo truce anymore. It's wartime.
Yeah.
But the U.S. is going to stop selling oil to Japan, flat out. You're just not getting any more oil from us, and froze all Japanese assets in the United States unless it withdrew from China and Indochina. The Japanese government, in all fairness, was divided on war versus peace with the U.S. I mean, I'm sure it's just like here. You have people here that are divided on whether or not we support Ukraine or whether or not we support Israel or you name it.
Sure.
You go back to our wars. There were people that were divided on whether or not we should be in those wars or not, and the same can be said about Japan. Uh, all that aside, though, with all the things that had taken place, you know, the Japanese, I guess, higher ups, their higher echelon planners and commanders realized, war is pretty much inevitable at this point.
Yeah.
The U.S. has taken away our oil, which the U.S. I didn't mention this earlier supplied 80% of the Japanese oil consumption. Right, so
That's
I mean,
most of it, yeah.
this overwhelming majority, and then with all these mandates, this, that, and the other, they feel as though that we can't. I mean, it's going to happen. So on March 27th, 1941, Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa is sent to Honolulu, Hawaii, and begins studying the Pacific Fleet. Their station in Hawaii. Starts taking photographs, making plans, sending it all back to Japan so they can make their attack plan for Pearl Harbor.
So in any event, by the mid-November, Joseph Grew, he's the United States ambassador to Japan. He's going to send a message to the State Department that Japan has plans to launch an attack against Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the warning is completely ignored.
Which is unbelievable, dude. Unbelievable.
With everything they got going on, it is unbelievable.
There's like a lot of conspiracy talk with all that. I mean, I guess not conspiracy, but there's a lot of whiffs when it comes to how the U.S. responded to all this different intelligence coming in regarding the attack at Pearl Harbor. I mean, even down to the day of, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But
so the Japanese attack fleet, they have 33 warships and auxiliary crafts, including 6 aircraft carriers. They sail from northern Japan for the Hawaiian Islands. Next day, on the 27th, President Roosevelt issues a war warning for the Pacific, which is also largely ignored by Hawaii. Now, I get it.
Because there's other islands closer.
Yes.
Let's put this into perspective.
We got guys in the Philippines
right.
and closer to Japan than Hawaii.
There's a lot more closer to. There's Midway Island, there's Wake Island, there's the Philippines, there's Malaya, there's you name it. They're all closer to Japan than Hawaii is. But
keep an eye out.
In that same breath, the grand jewel of the Pacific is sitting in Pearl Harbor, right? The Pacific Fleet, dude. Like, that is our prized possession in that theater of operations. And it's sitting there, and it's crazy to me that they don't take the war warning. Either they don't take it seriously or they aren't giving it.
Next morning, December 7th, 7:02 a.m. local time. I'm going to read this one here. 2 U.S. radar operators identify large groups of aircraft in flight towards the island of Oahu from the north. They were told kind of, no big deal. We're expecting B-17s. A flight of B-17s are coming in the island. So no alarm was raised. Well, it wasn't B-17s. So that was just at 7:02 a.m. And now just before 8 a.m., it actually turns out to be, on a Sunday morning, 353 Japanese aircraft taking part in the surprise attack. And as Japanese bombs and torpedoes hit their targets, the devastation and the carnage just immediately ensues. And it's just massive. Now, not only are there American casualties and things destroyed, and the attack goes on for a long time. There's guys fighting back, trying to do best they can. There's civilians as well. All in all, military and civilian casualties, 2,403 Americans are killed in the attack. Approximately another 1,178 wounded. So it's just complete carnage.
Besides all of the obvious loss of life and wounded and you name it, right? I mean, it's the Pacific Fleet are the gem of the Pacific theater, right? At least in the U.S., from the U.S. perspective, has just been devastated. I mean, we out of the I think it's like 8 battleships that are there, 6 to 8 battleships. You've got 4 are sunk, 2 are heavily damaged, 1's lightly damaged. Out of the 4 that are sunk, two of them, it's catastrophic. Obviously, the USS Arizona takes the biggest loss of life with it. It sinks and has over 1,100 crew members go down with the ship.
Yes. And
obviously, you've seen in movies and you know about this, but like they're stuck alive in the ship. They're beating on the ship's hull, like people are trying to get those welding guns to get them out,
Yep,
and they can't.
yep.
Like I can't even imagine that. And then you have the USS Oklahoma capsizes and it ends up taking the lives of 429 crew members with it. You have 2 ships. Now this is interesting and something to point out. The USS California and the USS West Virginia are both going to be sunk at Pearl Harbor,
Okay.
but they will get those ships, collect those ships, repair them, and those ships will be returned to service by 1944.
Wow.
So later on,
Raised from the dead.
they're going to be duking it out with the Japanese later on in the war, which is kind of cool.
It is.
It's like a rising up from the ashes, like a phoenix or something.
Yeah, yeah.
There's numerous other ships that are destroyed, cruisers, destroyers. I mean, you name it. They're all. It's absolute chaos. But needless to say, war has come.
Yes.